From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. With about 3 weeks from the start of the 89th Texas legislative session, political lines are being drawn over the speaker's race. And now the state Republican Party is threatening to censor lawmakers who break away from the pact, an act that could ban them from running in a future primary. More on that in just a minute, but first, let's get to the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics, starting with an update from last week's edition of Texas This Week. Attorney General Ken Paxton stopped Texas death row inmate Robert Robertson from testifying before a House committee on Friday. Last week, chair of the House Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence, State Rep Joe Moody, told us he issued a second subpoena for Robertson to appear. Lawmakers want to hear about his experience of trying to get a new trial based on the state's junk science law. Robertson was sentenced to death for the 2002 death of his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. Prosecutors say she died from shaken baby syndrome, but Robertson's attorneys say that theory was debunked. Thursday night, the Attorney General's office filed for a protective order excusing the Texas Department of Criminal Justice from complying with that subpoena until there's a hearing and motion on the order. He's requesting a trial date of January 13th, the day before the next legislative session starts, and the committee requesting to hear from Robertson expires. The state of Texas has a new strategy to deter migrants from illegally crossing the Mexico border into the Lone Star State. On Thursday, Governor Greg Abbott unveiled a $100,000 billboard campaign. The billboards are being installed in Mexico and Central America, displaying messages like, "How much did you pay to have your daughter raped?" and "If you cross the border illegally into Texas, you will be jailed." U.S. Representative Greg Casar from Austin will now lead a coalition of Democrats on Capitol Hill. The former Austin City Council member was elected chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Casar says Democrats must focus on American workers over culture wars. The Republican Party of Texas is putting pressure on State Representative Dustin Burrows to drop out of the race for the Speaker of the Texas House, running a new TV ad in his hometown of Lubbock.
Dustin Burrows made a promise.
I want to see the next Republican speaker to be able to fully show that he has support of the majority of the members of the Republican caucus.
But when Republicans rejected his bid to be speaker, Burrows broke that promise. His own colleagues said Burrows stomped out of the room like a child because he didn't get his way.
This comes as the party is threatening to censor members who don't back House GOP caucus nominee Representative David Cook and ban members from running in the next primary. Joshua Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin, joined me to talk about whether the party can actually do that. It seems like there was already a lot of tension about this House race between David Cook and Dustin Burrows. Talk to us, get us caught up on exactly what happened.
Yeah, well, ultimately, the current Speaker of the House, Representative Dade Phelan, recently dropped out of the race for Speaker after realizing that he was not going to be able to get enough votes necessary to retain the speakership. He was already facing a challenge from Representative Cook, and with Phelan dropping out of the race, Representative Burrows jumped in at the last minute. Ultimately, this is the continuation of what has been a years-long, if not multi-year fight within the Texas Republican Party about who is going to have control over the agenda and who ultimately is going to lead the Texas House.
Yeah, and so what we saw at the behind closed door meeting is you had 2 votes and a group of supporters of Representative Burrows walked out, and then that sort of allowed Representative Cook to win the vote, to win the caucus pick. And the Texas GOP has said when time comes, when the legislative session starts and the vote happens for Speaker of the House, if members don't vote for Representative Cook, that they want to censor members of the House.
Yeah, this raises a really interesting and potentially problematic situation. The rules for the Republican caucus in the Texas House state that if a member receives a supermajority of the vote of the caucus, then they shall be supported by the entire caucus when the vote happens in the legislature for the speaker. That's a vote that takes place among Democrats and Republicans, and this is a way to enforce a certain amount of party fealty among Republicans. The issue here is that the Republican caucus has no way to enforce these rules. So in is stepping the Republican Party, the state party apparatus, saying if we can enforce those caucus rules by essentially prohibiting House members who don't vote with the caucus from participating in Republican primaries. Ultimately, this is an unusual situation because normally the party acts to support elected officials, not to keep them from their electorate.
I think there are people at home who go, wait a minute. How can the state Republican Party stop people from running for office, in the primary?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think what you'd find is that the state Republican Party isn't entirely sure whether it's able to do this itself, because right after the rule that's passed by the party that would allow it to prohibit members from running in their primaries, it also says that it will cover the legal expenses of anybody who implements this, which indicates that they know that it's likely that this is not something that the state or U.S. constitutions will allow, although it's not necessarily clear that it doesn't.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So, I mean, if we're just looking into a magic crystal ball here and guessing about what could happen. So are they suggesting that you could have a member who is banned from running in the primary, but then that wouldn't necessarily stop them from running as an independent candidate or, something of that nature later on? They could still be on a ballot in November, right?
They sure could, but ultimately what you're describing is really a chaotic situation in which the party essentially prohibits duly elected incumbent members of their party from running under the party's name. If those members were to then decide to run as independent candidates or, even less likely as Democrats, you'd create a very odd situation for voters. And I think what a lot of people may be asking themselves is why a group of unelected officials in the terms of the party organization, the people who operate the Republican Party of Texas, are now getting to decide who voters get to vote for or not.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting. I would imagine a lot of Republican voters, particularly if this is their elected official, have a lot of thoughts about that. Does this speak to, obviously it does, so you tell us, how does this say, or what does this say about the bigger infighting that's happening among Republicans in Texas right now?
Yeah, this is an ongoing story. And what you have is that you have a party that's been in power for the better part of the last 2 decades. And what that means in a lot of ways is that with sort of all this success ultimately comes conflict. Because what this is really about who is going to set the Republican agenda. Is it going to be Greg Abbott? Is it going to be Dan Patrick? Is it going to be the Speaker of the Texas House, or is it going to be outside groups? And all of those players at this point are trying to put their thumb on the scale and essentially create a situation in which they're going to get more of what they want when the session finally ends.
Have you seen something like this happen before? I know I've not seen anything like this level of fighting within the Republican Party or within, Texas politics. So what about you, though? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think what we've seen starting, even last year during the Republican primaries when Governor Abbott weighed in on a number of Republican primaries and endorsed against incumbent Republicans, that was the beginning of uncharted territory. So while the infighting has been constant, while the name calling is just part of politics, what is unusual is seeing state actors using, again, party resources and candidate resources to really, spend more effort going after their own than going after the opposing party. And that is really what, Texas politics is looking like at the moment.
We did ask leaders of the Texas GOP for an interview about the rule and potential of keeping elected officials from running for re-election. They pointed us to the party's rule. That's Texas This Week.